Everyone, I guess I can hear myself, so I don't have to ask if the microphone's working. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Appreciate the time on an afternoon, and I know we have a good crew online. Real quick, my name's Jeff Green. I run the cyber. Know her. She's currently the Deputy National Cyber Director for Technology and Ecosystem Security. I had to write that down. She came to ONCD from Google, where she was the Global Head of Product Security Strategy, also served in DHS in the Obama-Biden administration, and also of note, she's the co-founder of Share the Mic in Cyber, which aims to highlight the need for increased diversity in the cyber community. Camille, if we can start talking about the big picture, give us a sense of, as you all built out Pillar 4, as you got, I'm sure, endless feedback from the interagency, what was in your mind, what was the intent, and can you just give us a bit of an overview of what's in there?
Sure. So first, thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming out today. Pillar 4, to me, is the most fun, and maybe that's because it reflects a lot of the portfolio in the technology and ecosystem division, and it's the future resilience. One of the aims of the Office of the National Cyber Director is to focus on moving towards a digital ecosystem that is secure, resilient, and equitable. And a lot of what's in Pillar 4 is how do we make sure that we are investing in a future that's resilient and defensible. So you'll see things about emerging technologies like quantum. You'll see things about protecting the foundations of the internet. You'll see a focus on R&D and innovation. And the goal is not to let stopping the bleeding be the only thing that we focus on in this strategy. We want to set an affirmative vision for where we need to go. The strategy purports two fundamental shifts. One, realigning the ecosystem to make cyber defenses, the responsibility of the big players rather than the small players, right? So how do cloud hyperscalers, how do large tech companies take on that burden and shift it away from smaller players like individuals, local governments, small companies? The other one is realigning incentives to make long-term investments rather than short-term wins. So no quick fixes. How do we invest for long-term success? How do we shift market incentives to support that and such that our market is working in our favor in terms of security, resilience, and defensibility? And so with that in mind, you cannot focus only on what's happening today. How do we apply the lessons learned, the best practices, the wins we've seen, the best of technology to our future digital ecosystem? And so that's where the investments are focused.
So I love the idea of stopping, not just stopping the bleeding, because in the day-to-day, most cyber professionals can't look much past this week's patch or this week's crisis. So it's great for the White House to be pushing that out. Kind of picking up on that, one of the themes is research and development you have in Pillar 4, and there have been a number of studies. Aspen was part of one a few years back, showing the decline in tech R&D, both in the government and the private sector. Can you talk a little bit about how you think the White House and the administration can drive that? What do you think is the balance, public-private partnership on that, and how you see that evolving?
Innovation is a hallmark of our economy. We have to continue to invest in research and development, and that'll take work on both sides. In the federal government, in nonprofit, in the private sector writ large, we all need to be focused on research and development to boost innovation. And so in the federal government, a lot of the implementation you'll see is us focusing on how do we support an innovation economy, an R&D economy that can enable the market to continue that work. How do we get more players in? How do we engage philanthropy? How do we engage all of these other actors in the ecosystem to make sure that we are investing in R&D that spurs resilience and security in the innovations that we're making? And so what you'll see in the strategy at a glimpse, but what you'll definitely see in the implementation and as the work begins is that focus. How do we engage all players? How does the federal government use its purse, use its influence, its R&D dollars to support that innovation?
So get to implementation in a little bit. If I could follow up on the question of government investment, there were some pretty significant spending bills or investment bills in the last year. How do you see them tying into the strategy generally, Pillar 4, and the R&D? It feels like there's some synergy there, and I've seen some guidance come out recently talking about cyber and investments.
Yeah, that's a key example. We've made a lot of infrastructure investments through CHIPS, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, IRA, all of those things. And wrapped in that is cybersecurity related investment, making sure that the infrastructure spend that we have, that we are investing in through these bills, includes security and resilience by design. And so those things go hand in hand. As we are funneling money to make sure that we have a strong semiconductor market. And as we make sure that our infrastructure is resilient, how do we make sure cybersecurity is being considered by design upfront?
Can we talk a little bit about the digital identity ecosystem? Because that's one of the strategic goals. Not the first time we've seen this, not the first time we've seen it in a government document. I'm seeing folks who are involved in the NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. But the market and the world has evolved a bit since then. You have private sector players, now you have states getting involved in their own right. Um, do you think we have a better opportunity for federal success, or do you think it should be state and private sector driven? How do you balance all those different equities in a much more evolved market?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we've seen even from the 2011 strategy is that no player operating alone is going to be successful on digital identity. So it will take federal work, it will continue to take state work, it'll take private sector work, but we need to be working together and collaborating on a common direction. And so what the strategy proposes is us focusing collaboratively on moving forward on digital identity. Uh, One of the things you'll see is there are not a lot of privacy preserving technologies on digital identity. And that gap creates a lot of opportunity for identity fraud. That came up in the president's State of the Union address, that he really wants to hone in on protecting us because that affects all of us. And so the work that we need to do is making sure that federal resources are being and R&D in particular are being focused on digital identity. There are legislative opportunities, the state work that's going on, even with driver's licenses. That kind of work needs to consider security, privacy, civil liberties, interoperability, equity by design, and we need to be learning from those. States are a great incubation for us to understand how digital identity impacts our daily lives. And we can leverage that to incorporate it into the federal work that's going on.
So, in doing that, how do you reach communities that are not, and I know the broadband is part of it, but you're trying to reach communities that don't have as big a digital footprint, and you want to make sure you advance this, but don't leave them behind. How do you, thoughts on balancing that? Is that federal mandate through the states, or is it the same type of joint work you're talking about?
I think that's something we'll have to explore collaboratively, but you'll see things like the digital equity money and the investments coming out of commerce and the grant funding. So we're really putting a lot of money and effort into figuring out how we engage communities that have been traditionally left out of some of these advancements and investments, particularly in broadband and connectivity. So how do we make sure that we don't create a digital identity schema where a segment of the population is unable to engage? That's why we need the collaboration, because it won't be just a federal effort. Yes, there may be some requirements, there may be some collaboration on the state level to drive that forward, but private sector has to be thinking about that first and foremost in what they design. States have to be thinking about that in the schemas that they develop for driver's licenses and other things.
So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here. I warned you about this one. So technical foundations of the internet, one of the strategic goals. Um, those of us in the community have talked for a long time about Border Gateway Protocol, BGP, potential risk, threat, vulnerability there. But it is now in a national strategy as something we need to address. Can you explain for the audience? Many people haven't heard of it. Most average citizens wouldn't know if it was abused. Why should we care, and how do you think we can address one of the tougher nuts to crack that's been out there for since the inception of the internet now?
Yeah, I mean, many of you know, but BGP is basically the postal system for the internet. It determines the fastest and most efficient route to get you to where you want to go. That is foundational to our use and the effectiveness of the internet. Its ability to serve us, its ability to be a part of the digital ecosystem, the digital landscape. If we don't protect those foundations, we are missing out on so much. Part of that future-focused resilience is making sure the things that we are building on top of are secure as well. There's a lot of hijacking risk. We've seen cryptocurrencies stolen from BGP risks. We have to invest in making sure that kind of a foundational capability is invested in, and it is part of us thinking about the future of the internet.
So with ONCD's role across the federal civilian agencies, is this something that you can do a government first, try to set the example, drive this out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can convene the federal partners to figure out what tools are in our toolkit to make advancements here. We can use the federal purse. That's always a good one. We can focus in on our R&D dollars on this as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to lead by example here, but we can't do it alone.
So one more question maybe, and I want to go to implementation, and this, got some music.
Mood music.
Welcome to Zoom. Please press pound.
Welcome to events in the modern age. The workforce strategy, you talk about it in there. I know that there's a lot of work ongoing. You guys have been at this. Can you give us any kind of preview, maybe if you want to make some news about when it might come out, or other things you want to share about where that's going?
Yeah, I mean, a focus on people is an important part of future resilience. And so we recognized pretty early on that one page in the broader national cybersecurity strategy was not going to do enough to really invest in making sure we had a workforce that met the need. We don't want this strategy to be focused on the symptom that we're all aware of, the 500 to 700,000 jobs that are unfilled. We wanted to focus on the root causes, really making sure folks are equipped and empowered in and through technology to understand the best of it, and so they can protect themselves from the worst of it. And while the National Cybersecurity Strategy does a great job of shifting that burden to the big players, we still need to be equipped, just like with literacy and numeracy, to be able to effectively leverage technology. So we're really focused on cyber skills and how do we equip all Americans with that. And that is a conduit for us to build out a cyber workforce that is robust, multidisciplinary, diverse, so we can bring the best we have to bear and meet that demand in terms of numbers, but more importantly, the dynamism of the industry. We need to be able to have a talent pool that is equipped to meet the challenges of today, but also adapt and change as the digital ecosystem evolves.
Any prediction on when we might see a strategy come out or some discussion of the pieces of it? We'd love to host you to have that conversation.
I mean, I appreciate the invitation, noted. I wish I knew exactly when, but sooner rather than later. The goal is to make sure that this strategy is whole of nation. So we had the RFI where we got 147 responses that spanned individuals all the way to consortiums of organizations. So we've gotten a lot of feedback there. We had the Workforce Summit in July of 2022 to kind of kick off the effort. We've had a number of engagements at universities and a lot of one-off conversations where we were getting feedback and input. And now we're working that through the interagency process as we continue to collaborate with our private sector partners. And we don't want to rush that. We want to make sure that this strategy actually does the things that I outlined, and to make sure we understand the challenge space, the opportunity space, and truly get to equipping all Americans and also creating that robust ecosystem where we've got the education and training apparatus to support a strong workforce, and we've got the retention and hiring apparatus within organizations to support a strong workforce. That's going to take time. Hopefully not too much, though.
And I'm sure the interagency process will be fun.
Always.
Actually, before I go to implementation, we're going to talk in the next panel a bit, I think, about the security of quantum encryption. I ask, so I've heard you speak about this a couple times and very passionately about the promise of quantum. You know, we'll talk a bit about why we need to make it secure. Can you talk about how you see that? Because I think the pillar talks about quantum security. I was a little surprised there wasn't talk about the promise of quantum. So I don't know if you can share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden-Harris administration has a twofold prong two-prong approach. That's a better way to say it. Two-prong approach to quantum. And one of them is, yes, the national security concerns, the cryptographic issues, also like when quantum meets AI, what are we afraid of? What are the opportunities there for our adversaries to leverage all the data they've collected? But more importantly, or just as important, are the opportunity. Quantum computing presents a lot of amazing opportunity for us to compute large data sets very quickly. We can make advancements in space. We can crank out vaccines and think through health implications. We can workshop a number of different things. And so there's a lot of opportunity with that quantum computing capability for us to make progress on a lot of really complex challenges much more quickly. And that is something we also want to make sure that we're focused on. So while we are thinking about how we protect ourselves, we also want to make sure that we are forward-leaning in the innovation space on quantum and that we are leading economic investment there so that we can also be leaders.
Great. On implementation, can you give us a sense on how you think that's going to roll out? Where might we see, you can't, well, I don't think you can move out on all of the strategic goals immediately. Have you prioritized what to start with, and what can we in the public expect to start seeing on that in the near future?
That's the exercise we're going through right now, is figuring out the implementation plan that will roll out. But some of the work has already begun. You'll see it coming out through departments and agencies, through divisions within OECD. There's a lot of great work where we are already pulling the principles from the strategy, pulling the lines of effort, and starting to make progress, aligning the federal government around the places that we need to truly invest, and figuring out our priorities and our aligning the timing. So you'll see a lot of detail in the implementation plan, but we're mobilizing the private sector. We're understanding where they're investing. We're encouraging them, and we are thinking through where we need to invest our priorities.
So you see a role for the private sector in helping to implement the parts of the strategy.
Definitely. I mean, we can't do this alone. Most of what you've seen in the strategy is that public-private partnerships are foundational. That collaboration will continue. We want to enrich that, make it more meaningful. This isn't just an information exchange. How do we truly collaborate on these things? So the private sector will continue to be very meaningfully engaged in the implementation of the strategy.
And do you see agencies taking the lead on certain parts of it? Is it going to be ONCD or a joint effort?
Oh, there are definitely parts of this owned by specific agencies. We will lead coordination to make sure we're all moving in the same direction, but the work will be spread out across the interagency. There's lots of fun for all.
So before I go to questions, one thing, when we were preparing for this, you and your team were very adamant to make sure that agencies got their due for the amount of work and the strategy. Do you want to speak a bit to the type of collaborative work you had across the agencies to get to the point where you have, for those of you who haven't been in the government, to get clearance on a document of this size is a truly Herculean and impressive. My first reaction when I saw it was, thank God I didn't have to get this cleared. But can you talk a little bit about your partners across the agencies?
Yeah, you'll see some representatives from two of the agencies in the next panel, but ONCD might have held the pen, but this was truly an interagency document. The interagency was very engaged on where this strategy should go. It is very forward-leaning. It builds on strategies of the past where we see information sharing and public-private partnerships, but really goes to the next level and really sets our own affirmative vision. Rather than focusing on how do we react to the adversary, the strategy looks ahead and sets where we want to go. And the interagency was instrumental in articulating that vision and understanding what tools were in our toolkit, what opportunities we had, and recognizing the work that was already ongoing and how we could continue to build on that. And so the collaboration to get a document of this size, to build this out, to clear it such that it accurately reflected all the work going on and the opportunity for the work to come is no small feat. So kudos to everyone involved.
I'm going to pause for a second. I know we may be having some issues on the Zoom. I don't know if someone from Aspen's here, if you need a second to kick something off on the Zoom so we can enjoy the music rather than be interrupted by it. All right, let's just keep going. From the audience, any folks with questions out there for Camille Stewart Gloucester Don't be shy. Oh, we're going to wait while they
That was
get this
well-timed
fired
music
up.
this time.
Welcome to Zoom. Please press pound. Then enter your meeting ID.
Welcome to Zoom. Thanks for your comments. My question was from something you said at the very beginning. Let us give you a mic so the folks on Zoom can hear. Nicole, that one's turned on. There we go. We got mics coming from all directions.
All directions. You will have a mic.
Don't drop them. I will just speak really loudly and say thank you for your comments. Try. Thank you for your comments.
I have one that works.
Thank you for your comments. The security protections here are excellent, obviously. My question related to something you said at the very beginning, and I'm Danny Weiss from Common Sense Media, that the focus is on large actors to ensure that large actors take the bulk of the responsibility for this and not as much small or individual actors. But could you speak to that other part? Do you see a role for the smaller and individual actors in terms of securing our cyber infrastructure?
Of course. I mean, small organizations, local governments will always have work to do to secure their own infrastructure, their own networks. But what we're hoping is that these bigger players that provide the infrastructure for small governments, that provide the infrastructure for businesses, are doing the work to make their products secure by design, to make them resilient, such that the burden, the heavy burden of thinking through how to build out a secure infrastructure and a secure network is not on those small players. Same thing for individuals. And one of the ways that we bridge that residual risk is through this workforce strategy. That's why there is a focus on those foundational cyber skills for everyone, so that similar to literacy and numeracy, individuals are focused and skilled appropriately to be able to leverage technology and to make choices about how they support their own privacy and their own security.
Question in front here.
We're like full service at Aspen.
Since I've been in and out of government since 1992 and worked in information sharing environment and helped with the Manning and Snowden report and blah, 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 I've heard all of this for 20 years. I mean, it really doesn't sound any different. Just like I worked on the task force for DOD, for Ash Carter, on how to improve cyber, how to improve the cyber workforce. Nothing happens. I told Jay Johnson, he said, well, why can't we hire cyber people? I said, because you have a problem. Like in the 70s, would you have ever hired someone that said they didn't smoke pot? And he said, probably not. I said, that's the problem. These private sector efforts, Karen Evans started one, that graduate hundreds of cyber experts that will not be hired by the government because they don't have a master's or they didn't go to MIT. And that's bullshit. I mean, there are high school teachers and privates in the Army that know this stuff. So you can solve that in a nanosecond, but it won't happen. And the issue, I mean, the government can't even take on simple things. I wrote a paper in 2020 or 2010 that said, why don't we just use encryption at rest and role-based access? We can't even do that.
So let me jump in real quick on a couple of things. I do think there are several new things in the strategy. From my perspective, I think having a White House document talk about shifting the burden away from individuals about software liability is in and of itself significant. And I know that ONCD did an event where you were for the workforce event, the number of internships that came out of that. So if we view something like that as seeding the future, I think that's an excellent point. And we've been talking about this in cyber for quite some time. Focusing on degrees is the wrong thing, but maybe you can speak to that and to the ONCD event that you.
Let's not forget OMB hack, SF86, everybody who has a TSSCI, all our shit is out there. So when we talk
I
about
appreciate
this,
that. Let's give her a chance to respond.
Yeah, I mean, much of this will come down to the implementation, which is why Jeff so aptly focused in on implementation in the questions. Most of the work that we had to do might not be novel, but some of the framing, some of the things that we are putting forward in the strategy, to Jeff's point, are new framings, new priorities for us. You will see the work in the implementation. right? In the workforce strategy, for the workforce strategy, we've already stood up a national cyber workforce coordination group, which aligns all the federal agencies around making progress on workforce. And the amount of progress we've seen to facilitate the drafting of this strategy, but also just to get our own house in order around workforce, has already been leaps and bounds. And so that work, coupled with the work to implement the national cyber strategy, you will see a lot more of what you're hoping to see. But the federal government is a big ship, so it doesn't change, it doesn't turn overnight, but the work is happening.
So let's take one more question. I see right up here. Mic is on its way.
Hello, Emily Otto. I had a question about with implementation as well. Are there any carrots or sticks that are maybe you're talking about, or thinking about implementing in order to actually support action?
I mean, the strategy does talk about leveraging regulation in the most limited form and where needed. So that is definitely a tool in our toolbox. The federal purse is another tool in our toolbox. Changing market incentives. I mean, there are a lot of tools outlined in that strategy that will leverage both carrots and sticks to drive towards these outcomes. Yeah.
I'll follow up there maybe because it was near and dear to me, but the Executive Order 14028, can you talk a little bit about particularly the government procurement there, trying to shift the focus on secure development and how that, I know there was a reference to that in the strategy. If you can talk about how that tied together.
Yeah, I mean, you can even look at software bill of materials and how we're leveraging that to increase transparency, but doing it in a way that doesn't overwhelm vendors and ensures that they have the opportunity to not only inform the process, but be able to keep up. So there's a lot of focus on leveraging the tools, but in a way that is collaborative and allows for the actors that we're working with, the private sector partners, to inform the development and move along with us, keep pace with us. But whether it's in the EO or in the strategy, there's a lot of focus on leveraging all of the tools in the toolbox and being collaborative to do so.
Great. Camille, thanks so much for your time. Oh, do you have time for one more?
Oh, great.
Let's sneak in one more.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just wondered whether there was any consideration given to, it seems to me that the original sin is this permanent waiver that Congress granted the software industry from the normal commercial requirements for merchantability and you know, to basically do what it says on the box. I mean, is there any chance would you try and get Congress to repeal that? Would that be a sort of the big lift on this shift of responsibility?
Congress has been eager to pass controversial bills over the past, but you know, the general positioning I think would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an option. As we pull folks together to look at software liability and how we build out a schema that actually supports the market and is something that companies can bear, particularly if you consider open source and all of these other factors, that is definitely an option on the table. Now, will we lean only on that? Probably not, because we have to let the legislature do what it does, but it will be a part of the calculus for sure.
Great. Camille, thanks again, and re-extend the invitation for the workforce strategy or any implementation pieces. We'd be happy to have you back up here. Everyone, please give a nice round of applause.
Thank you.
So we will now bring on our panel. First is Nicole Tisdale, who was doing yeoman's duty with the microphone. Nicole is Aspen's Senior Advisor for Cyber Workforce and Education. Most recently, she was at the National Security Council working on cyber and legislative matters. She spent a dozen years on the Hill, prior to that working on a variety of national security issues, and is the founder of Advocacy Blueprints. I see Helen Morgan. Our panelists are Morgan Adamski.
I'm going to ask you to stand to the podium so we can adjust the seats.
So we have four panelists coming on: Morgan Adamski, Eric Goldstein, Donna Dotson, and Ola Sage. Morgan is the director of the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center at the NSA, previously the Deputy Strategic Mission Manager, Deputy Strategic Mission Manager, and has been part of NSA's Computer Network Defense, Computer Network Exploitation, and Cyber Analysis missions for more than a decade. Eric is currently the Executive Assistant Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where he leads CISA's mission to protect federal civilian agencies and the nation's critical infrastructure against cyber threats. Before that, he was at Goldman Sachs as the head of cybersecurity policy, strategy, and regulation, and served in CISA's precursor agency, NPPD, from 2013 to 17. Donna Dotson recently joined Evolution Q as a senior strategic advisor, but most of you know her from her long and distinguished career at NIST and in the Department of Commerce, where she held technical and policy leadership positions. Among her many roles, she was NIST Chief Cybersecurity Advisor, the inaugural director of NIST National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and the Commerce Department's Cybersecurity Advisor. Finally, Ola Sage is the founder and CEO of CyberRx, which does cybersecurity risk and compliance assessments focused on critical infrastructure. Ola spent more than 20 years focused on cybersecurity readiness for small and medium-sized businesses. And over the years, she's been part of numerous public-private partnership efforts with DHS and other federal agencies. Ola is the past chair of the IT Sector Coordinating Council and currently serves on its executive committee. Thank you all for being here today, and I will hand it off to Nicole.
Sure. We'll go ahead and ask all the the panelists to come up. There's a step on this side too, if it's easier. This is what the Zoom music was keyed up to do, y'all. It was supposed to be playing now. We just got a little ahead of ourselves. So thank you all so much for joining us. We'll get, one more extra, right? I think we want to, as we were listening to the first conversation with Jeff and Camille, we were headed toward implementation. So I think it's very fitting that we have representation from the agencies, but also the private sector, who, no pressure, y'all are in charge of implementation. So I wanted to go ahead and kick us off. Eric, I'm going to start with you. Everyone has their favorite parts of the strategy. And as we just heard, people have a lot of questions about this strategy. For some folks, it feels like we've seen a version of this before. I always warn people, I'm like, the strategy is the map, which is going to decide how we get to the destination. So I never want the government just driving without a map. So I appreciate a good strategy. But what's your favorite part, or what is the most impressive part, and what do you see coming out of the gate in terms of first action for implementation?
Absolutely. First of all, Nicole, great to see you. Good to be here. Thanks to Jeff and the Aspen team, and I think Camille left, but thanks to our partners at ONCD, the broader White House, for developing what I think is a really impactful strategy that really changes the tenor and indeed in many ways the course of national cybersecurity. I have 3 kids. I can't pick my favorite, so similarly, I can't pick my favorite part of the strategy. But I'll speak in some broad contours about where I think the strategy is taking us, both generally and then narrowing down to a bit of a focus on Pillar 4. So, if we look at the overarching emphasis of the strategy as part of what certainly our agencies are doing, and I think the nation as a whole, the goal really is to address security needs in the broadest, most scalable ways possible. And so, looking at Pillar 4, if there's a way to address a security issue by dealing with the architecture of the internet that can help every single user, individual, enterprise, let's do that. If there's ways of addressing security risks by changing the way that we incentivize and enable security being built in by design and included by default in software and hardware that's used by thousands or millions of organizations, let's do that. And then and only then, let's really put the focus on the end user enterprise to put in place the most impactful controls, the most impactful measures. Because what we've been seeing historically in cybersecurity is that all of the burden has preponderantly been put on that end user, whether it's an enterprise or an individual. And in so doing, we have a few problems. First of all, we're not addressing the base layers of risk that we know have to do with technology that's designed insecurely or lacking basic features that would enable more security by default. And we know that in many cases, these end user enterprises aren't even able to adopt the right level of controls for the threats that they're up against. And so if you're a school district, if you're a hospital, if you're a water utility, and you're up against a nation state or ransomware gang, realistically, it's going to be really hard to stay on top of every single control, every single mitigation that you need to stay safe. And so I think the strategy is really part of this broader effort to say, let's figure out how we can address security measures at the most scalable possible level of the ecosystem and then narrow down from there. And if we can do that, if we can really address some of these architectural issues, like looking at secure BGP, for example, if we can get to a point where software and hardware is secure by design, for example, we're using memory-safe coding languages that knock out a lot of vulnerabilities categorically, and then we can say, okay, what's left? What do we need the enterprise to do that can't be done elsewhere? Then we'll be in a much different place than we are today. But of course, really the key is going to be, how do we first agree upon as a community about what those measures are? How do we drill down those levels of specificity? And then how do we build in place the right incentives, the right measurement, the right governance, so we actually make progress as a community in a collaborative way? And so I think the strategy is a critically important marker to drive us toward this new model where the burden is appropriately shared across actors in the ecosystem, and now's the time to really put it to work.
I think that's helpful context, Eric. And I love how I know the English major in me noticed how you were using a lot of we's and ours, and this to show that like this does have to be a collaborative effort. And I want the next question to go to you, Morgan. I know as the director of NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, we've like I working at the White House, I got to see you in action and like how you advocate for the private sector in real time, sometimes with a carrot, sometimes with a stick towards your colleagues in government. But as it relates to Pillar 4, what do you see in terms of your engagement with the private sector and implementation on the NSA side?
So I see two specific things. So first and foremost, thanks for having me, and completely agree with Eric. Right, this was a monumental lift to be able to get the strategy out. It really is unique in that it addresses so many significant areas that we talk about every single day. When we talk about, and I do have a favorite. I'm sorry, but my favorite is obviously the public-private partnership collaboration. It underpins all of the pillars in different ways. One of the main points is that public-private collaboration. People think sometimes that it's supposed to look a single way. It doesn't. We have a lot of different forums that serve different purposes. And what I will tell you that has been significant in terms of what we've done with the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, but also the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, is this intel-driven collaboration with the private sector, which is specifically fed into that desire to have context behind why they should care about modernizing certain technology or care about systematic risk, because we've said, here's the attack vectors, here's the things that we know our adversaries are targeting, and this is how you need to potentially address it. But it provides prioritization. And when you talk about systematic risk across a large scale, that can be eating the entire elephant, and it can be daunting. But if we're able to provide prioritization to our private sector partners and say, here's the top couple of things that we think you should probably pay attention to, and here's why, what we've been able to do is see this unity of effort in figuring out how to address them. Secondly, in the public-private partnership realm, I'm going to try not to say public-private partnerships 14 times, it's just the key term, is that it is really about a conversation with our private sector partners. And so when you talk about regulation, when you talk about changes, when you talk about secure by design, those are all fantastic principles that we're all working towards. But when it gets down to the practitioner and implementing it, you really need to fundamentally understand from the private sector, is this achievable? What are the things that I haven't thought about? And what I can tell you about a lot of our engagement that has occurred, and what we've learned over the last 3 years when we've been working to share intel with the private sector, is a lot of feedback that we've gotten is, okay, that's great, but that's not actually the data that I needed. That's not as timely as I need it to be. And this is the type of information that would help me actually defend my networks. And that's the conversation that I think we knew when we talk about resilient infrastructure for the future, is having an honest conversation about what is the type of information that we all need to make the right decisions.
That. And I think it's important when you talk about it is the conversation, because I think over time, as we've seen a lot of these strategies roll out, I think people in this room can attest, people haven't always felt like they feel like the strategy comes out and then an administration will say, and now we're working on implementation. And then you don't hear anything until a mandate rolls out. And it's like, okay, how do we make sure that the people who are going to be responsible for these, responsible for helping to enforce these policies are a part of the policymaking process? So inputs as well as outputs, which leads me to Ola. I'm going to turn to you because we're talking a lot about what the private sector engagement should be. And I know as a member of the IT sector coordinating councils, executive committee, this is literally a part of your job as well. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about, as we speak to Pillar 4, what do you think the role is, or is there a role for the private sector to help with the implementation of Pillar 4 in the strategy?
Yes, and this is my second 40-hour job, is it? Or third 40-hour job?
No, you never can tell with women. We'll go with 3, 4.
Yes, and I love the question, whoever asked it about small business role in this. I think, somebody also asked about the implementation plan. I think we might need a national small business cybersecurity implementation plan because there's just so much. And it's frankly a little bit overwhelming. And everybody wants to help small businesses, and we love that. And it also means that it can be a challenge trying to figure out where to start, et cetera. But one place potentially to start, as it relates to at least critical infrastructure, is with the sector coordinating councils. And, while a lot of small businesses may not have a lot of money, our contribution can be our time and expertise. And that translates to dollars, right? Time is money. And so I think there's an opportunity for, at least in the IT sector, to engage more companies to participate, more small, medium-sized businesses to participate, because what's that saying? If you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. Yeah. And so I know I gave Eric a heads up. I told him I was going to talk about him. But in the IT sector, we've always had a very strong small business kind of support and encouragement and advocacy and all that. But it's been kind of topic specific. And we're getting ready to really set up a standing IT sector SMB working group that can really take on some of these issues as they come up, because they evolve, right? We don't have a static environment. And I think that would be something that might be a really useful tool for other sectors as well, to think about something like that.
I think that is a good example. I feel like a lot of times, you're right. Once you join one of these councils, like someone is asking you to do a public service of like, can you come help the federal government for free in all of your free time that you have? But I think we've all seen firsthand those ideas, those concepts, those recommendations that come out of these councils. For a lot of the folks that are trying to make the policy, it's not that people are trying to not be inclusive, they just don't have the perspective. And so it's always a lot when the government is asking people to participate on those councils. And so I'm glad that you're saying positive things. And I would encourage other folks to get involved in their sector specific councils as well, because that is where the implementation comes from. That is where you're going to see the policies. And so I want, as we're talking very high level, I don't want to scare anyone in the room, but now we're going to do a deep dive, and we're going to turn this into a whole talk about post-quantum computing. I'm kind of joking, but not really. Because we actually, when we talk about Pillar 4 are all of the things in the future. And you heard Camille say earlier, we've got to be able in cyber to not just put out the current fire. We have to think about what's ahead. And so, Donna, I wanted to turn to you. Specifically in Pillar 4.3 focuses on preparing for our post-quantum future, which sounds kind of scary. But I want to know in particular, can you explain to a layperson what it is? Should I be afraid? And how is this strategy going to move toward implementation? Or how do you hope the strategy will move toward implementation?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that we're seeing in the strategy, and they've done an excellent job laying out both short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. And the challenge will be in the implementation and how we think about what we want to do, and then, as Morgan rightly said, how we work with the private sector to get there, instead of here are the 5 things that you have to do, right? How do you listen and think, how do you do this? And what is it that you're trying to protect? And that comes into play when you think about cryptography and why are you using cryptography? What are you using it for? And what is it that you're trying to protect? And when you think about this, it helps you come up with your your strategy for the day when we have quantum computers. Because when we have quantum computers, they will actually break the math behind many of the crypto algorithms that we're using today. And as we break that math, we have to put in new algorithms. But when we put those new algorithms in place, we have more work to do than just drop in those new crypto algorithms and we're good to go. This is an opportunity for the federal government. It's an opportunity for industry to think about resiliency in our cryptographic infrastructure. And so, as we're thinking about implementation plans, we can think about cryptographic resiliency. Why is this important? It's important because cryptography is a fundamental tool in our cybersecurity tool chest that we use from that BGP example that Eric put forward. We use cryptography there all the way up to our applications with our healthcare data that we're protecting, to our identity management programs, et cetera. So how do we build resiliency in? How do we think about the physics aspect that quantum is bringing? What are the opportunities from bringing together physics and math together to build that crypto toolkit? I came from NIST. I was working with the crypto team there as they started with the algorithms and working with the international community and NSA and many of the folks in this room did a great job and have come up with algorithms that we can use as replacements. That's this much of the work. There's a lot more work that has to be done for this crypto platform as we get prepared for the world when we have quantum computers. And I think we're really focused on bringing these algorithms in and how do we swap out RSA and how do we put a lattice-based algorithm in place. But we have protocols to think about, we have key management to think about, we have these algorithms that are not drop-in replacements for where we are today. So we have an opportunity to have a much more resilient crypto platform instead of a brittle platform that we kind of have today. So I'm hoping that the implementation plan will look at this opportunity for a crypto platform instead of, oh my gosh, this is big and scary. It's not. It could actually be fun.
I'm going to take your word for it, Donna. I believe it could be fun, and I think as you say that, I think it highlights a very important part that is weaved all throughout Pillar 4, which is the research and development. And I love how you say this when you said it could be fun, but also it could be something very different. And we don't have to always have these, because it's always been here. It's not a reason for it to currently exist. And so as we talk about research and development, and I also don't want this to feel like too school teacher. Y'all should jump in if you all want to add to anyone's point. But Eric and Morgan, I want to talk to you all about what does research and development look like within Pillar 4 as well, because this is a lot of forward-leaning initiatives that you all are going to undertake. And we know the government doesn't have all of this information. They don't have all of these tools. So what does private sector engagement look like specific to research and development? And how can people get involved?
Sure. So there we go. Donna, that was awesome. We need way more fun in cybersecurity. A lot of times we are very focused on the
Dark cloud.
the dark cloud. Thank you. Yes, the increasing worsening of the threat perpetually day on day on day on. And so the more fun we can have, the better. So Donna, thank you for adding that note of levity to the panel. It was much needed. So I'll offer sort of a somewhat different take on the R&D question beyond the applied research questions that we have to delve into, because part of the challenge we face in figuring out where to invest and how to apportion investment between the providers of internet infrastructure, the developers of technology, hardware and software, and the end users at the enterprise or individual level of technology product is how breaches actually occur and what investments, what security controls, what security measures are actually most effective in stopping harm from occurring. And one overarching challenge in cybersecurity today is we actually have really bad data in not only how breaches occur, as in what was the initial access, but actually how the adversary achieves their action on objectives, right? And so we say a lot of times, well, it was a phishing attack. Well, that might have been the initial access, but a lot of other things went wrong that allowed damage to occur, whether it was data being stolen, data being encrypted, what have you. And today, we just don't have the data to be able to say with real conclusiveness, here is what the developer of that software product could have done differently. Here's what the enterprise user could have done differently. And so one area of research that we are really focused on is really gathering data from our partners across the private sector at all levels of the ecosystem to really get a better answer to that question. Because as we get more and more specific, as guided by the National Cybersecurity Strategy of what are the measures that we think define products that are secure by design and default, what are those measures that enterprises need to take to defend themselves that they really can't burden share with a provider upstream, we need to know how to ground those in data so that we can actually say, listen, if you do these, this is a smart business decision because you have a reasonable expectation of fewer intrusions, less damage, less harm. Without that data, we're guessing too much. And so the more that we can share in this voluntary model about how breaches happen and what controls worked and didn't work, the better we'll be. It's also why we at CISA are so excited for our incident reporting rule soon to come that's going to give us a much better body of information so that we can understand for incidents across the country, across sectors, how are they happening, what could have stopped them, and what was effective in minimizing harm, so we can translate that into guidance or direction that can help organizations at every level take the right steps first.
I'll pivot a little bit back to what Camille brought up in terms of innovation, right? And so when we talk about the cybersecurity community and the technology that they are creating to better protect against these very commonly used access vectors, we really need to have that collaboration and conversation about here's the products, here's what they offer, here's the different type of data. It was kind of talked about the fact with small to medium-sized companies, they get all these pamphlets, right? Here's all the cybersecurity services that you can use. And most of that terminology of cybersecurity services is at a high level. It doesn't talk at the technical level of what they're actually getting out of it. So I think from an innovation perspective, I know in the Department of Defense and at the National Security Agency, we're really trying to figure out how do we pilot these capabilities in terms of what's innovative, what really helps protect against these attack vectors in a short-term way to see what's most effective, and either on-ramp it to scale it out to more small to medium-sized companies, or do we need to then pivot, provide feedback, and make it better for the community in general? And so I think innovation, a key aspect of the pillar there. I would like to go back to post-quantum. Can I go back? I'm still trying to be fun, so I'm going to be fun. So, I just want to talk, Donna did a phenomenal job of outlining the significance of it, but, when she came down to timing and details, just needs to be talked about how complex this is, right? So the National Security Agency plays a key role in the Keys Code and crypto mission. There are millions of devices worldwide. And, when we talk about what the steps are for that modernization, first you have to get rid of actual crypto that's old that needs to move. But then from a modernization perspective, I would offer this is that, we have to update our math, as Donna pointed out. We have to then actually inventory all of the devices worldwide to get a better understanding of what needs to actually be updated. Then we have to update the software and the hardware. And so from a Department of Defense perspective, the US Air Force is not driving their fighter jets down 295 to NSA every 5,000 miles for an oil change. Okay, so we now then have to do the scheduling and the timing to update all of that software and hardware. And so while National Security Memorandum 10 outlines, I think, 2033 as the deadline to do all this modernization, that timeline will come very quick in terms of how we phase all of this out. And so, working with our NIST colleagues in the community, this is going to take a huge lift that we have to start yesterday. And so I think it's something that we're putting a lot of emphasis on. I would also just touch on the fact that, and Donna mentioned this, International standards bodies and having a key role in the secure protocols in this arena is a key aspect of the work that we need to do with our private sector partners as well, right? And that is a joint public-private partnership conversation.
This is an opportunity to think about crypto agility, though, to get back to that, so that in 5 years, when we need to change to a different algorithm or a different key size, you don't have to bring those ships in. You don't have to bring those those fighter jets in. And we've not built that crypto platform to have that kind of agility. And in cybersecurity, often we don't think about that when we're building these kinds of capabilities, whether it's cryptography or whether it's some other kind of service around authentication or digital identities. These kinds of capabilities that we're looking at, how do we build them so that they do have that sort of resilience and that they can work in different environments? And I think we do I think this is an opportunity where the government can work closely with some of the bigger providers out there who can and do often turn things on a dime, because I had an opportunity to work with some of the bigger providers after I left government, and I saw how quickly and how agile they were with some of the changes that they were able to make. And it was because they did that architecture and that good thought provoking development up front, instead of, I got to get this, I have this mandate, I've got to get this done. I'll put something down on paper and then I'll go ahead and do it. And then I'll try to figure out what the right answer is later on. And that's that approach where you don't have people like really poking at what you want to do with that architecture, those really smart minds going back and forth and looking at it for a little while and saying, well, what about this or what about that? um, we have an opportunity to work together to do some of that, so that we can get some of these platforms so that they are resilient. And I think really, when I joked and said, okay, crypto can be fun, it can be fun because we have an opportunity to create that kind of platform, not just in cryptography, but in other places in cybersecurity. So we do have an opportunity to partner with some of these folks, as has been stated earlier.
Yeah, I think that I would also add to the point too, um, the work that needs to be done in post quantum computing analysis and the research. It's still a very bipartisan issue on the Hill. I remember very clearly working on some of those provisions in last year's NDA, but then seeing it again in like the CHIPS Act. And I think Congress has also given the community and the executive branch space to know, like, we're not in a place to legislate, but we want to empower the communities to do the research and then bring it to Congress, and then we'll make decisions from there. And that's very rare, y'all. So I feel like people should be taking advantage of that. So Eric, I love when you talked about the data that is still needed in cybersecurity and how much data we need. I always joke with people. I worked on passage of the Cyber Incident Reporting Act, and it was really a data collection bill, but that doesn't go well in this town, depending on who hears that language. Also, it's just not fun enough for people. But so I say that to say I speak Govy, and I know how government speak works. But there were a couple of sections in the strategy where I was like, I don't know what this is. So you're about to be responsible for it because I didn't get to ask my questions to Camille.
I defer.
All right, so we're going to be very specific. So Strategic Objective 4.1 talks about securing the technical foundation of the internet and talks about the border gateway protocol. But there is a specific sentence that says unencrypted domain name system request and more. I'm going to need you to translate this into English. And we need this. I always say this in cybersecurity. It's important for all the people in this room who got really excited when the cyber strategy came out to be able to talk to people who had no idea that the cyber strategy came out. They don't know where you are this afternoon. They think you just left work early. what are we talking about? And also, why should the average person care about this?
I'm going to start with the second point because actually I think it is far more interesting. Really, I should defer to Donna, who is one of the most brilliant practitioners in this space, to actually explain BGP and secure DNS. But I'll give it a shot as well. But I think the starting point needs to be that we all know in this room that every function of our daily life now depends on network technologies, on software and hardware, and the network of networks that comprises the public internet. But of course, there have been design decisions over the past 40 or so years that have been largely cobbled together, the help of some underlying standards, but largely a series of independent design decisions that have led us to the point where this connectivity enables absolutely extraordinary efficiency, productivity, social activities that would have been unimaginable when the internet was designed by some DoD practitioners and academic researchers, 40 some years ago. But the result of that is that across the board, these systems were never designed to be secure and resilient in the face of continuous, persistent, advanced attacks from militaries, intelligence agencies, and criminal gangs, right? It was never the idea of the system. And so this is true on the backbone of the internet, which is what 4.1 focuses on. It's also true in the way that we design, build, and use software and hardware even today. When by and large, most products are designed for good reasons, focusing on features, focusing on cost, focusing on time to market, focusing on advancing the usability of these technologies that, again, have enabled absolutely unimaginable advances. But that's sort of the problem is, we've never said, let's just pause for a second and have a conversation about how we make investment decisions in the technology that we're using and what's our level of confidence that these technologies are fit for purpose, particularly for the most critical applications to which they're being applied. I think that really is the strategic overlay of the strategy, in part in goal 3, which is focused really on how do we say, let's make sure that if we are using a piece of software or hardware for a national critical function, for example, that we are really confident that we've done everything we can to make sure that we are not, that we are reducing the prevalence of exploitable conditions, and we have the right security controls embedded by default such that we are making life as hard as possible for our adversaries. Goal 4.1 is actually taking a broader approach and saying, let's look, for example, at how the internet itself was architected and designed. And so, for example, we know that the way the traffic is routed throughout the internet using a protocol called BGP, is able to be spoofed or hijacked by malicious adversaries who are able to route internet traffic to where it wasn't supposed to go. And so you can think that you are sending a communication to your university or business, but in fact, that could be rerouted to a computer in Russia or China, for example. And we know that there are ways to secure this protocol in a way that makes it more hardened to hijacking and to rerouting. Real credit to our partners at the FCC who are actually looking into this issue and figuring out, is there more change that we can make at the level of the ISP? But broadly, these changes have not been adopted widely. And so, we know that there are these fundamental, network level changes that we could make that would knock out categories of attacks. There are changes that we can make in how we design and build hardware and software that would knock out categories of attacks. There's security controls that we can embed in software products that would knock out categories of attacks. And if we do all of that work, that's actually going to leave a fairly thin layer of attacks that are still the burden of the end user enterprise to address. And that's a much better world than the world we're in today, in which almost every kind of attack is, to some degree, offloaded on the end user enterprise to address, at least with many products that they're using today. And so our goal is really, I think, in the strategy, is a better equilibrium to say, let's figure out what the easiest and most scalable place to address a certain type of attack is. Let's address it there and then move forward.
I like that. And just a flag for everybody, we're gonna open it up. I want to do one more round of questions, and then we'll open it to the audience for Q&A. So, as we talk about implementation, I want to make sure people leave with like a concrete way that they could get involved in implementation, other than sending us messages on our LinkedIn after this event, which is fine. But I think we also, like, we've talked a lot about this is very forward leaning, but we also recognize this is a very robust strategy. It touches on, even just focusing on pillar 4, touches on a lot of different topics, a lot of different issues. And one of the things that I think is going to be probably the hardest part of implementation is engagement and to be informed on the process as it's going along. So I don't want to just put this question to our our friends that are in government. Also want Donna and Ola, you all to weigh in too. What is something that people can do? How can the private sector engage with the government to help implementation? And what does that look like from your seat in government and also from the private sector? Ola?
Sorry. So this might be the entrepreneur in me, but I just see opportunity, and particularly for small businesses. Sometimes we're perceived as just the victims. We have to be saved from everything. But I really think we can have a front row seat in all of these areas, in Pillar 4 explicitly. So whether it's the investment in R&D, that's a place where an entrepreneur who has an idea wants to research something in this area. I mean, part of what I really appreciate about the strategy is the specifics. These are the areas we want to invest in, right? So it's clear. And if you already have a business, maybe you start another one. But I just think that this whole idea of being in a position to really play a critical role, I think is really important for SMBs. The other thing, and I don't remember who said it, may have been Camille, about getting involved with the standards development. Whew, I mean, you know, that's not an area that a lot of small businesses play in, but I really believe policy standards, they're not just to encourage competition. It can really, for a lot of small businesses, um, influence whether you can exist or not. And so I think if we can get more small businesses involved in policy and standards development, I think that those could be important roles that we could play.
I think there's an opportunity to be able to sit down and again have those important conversations, not just I don't like this, but here's a way where we can get to this outcome that you're looking for. And here's a way to do this that exists where we're working for this technology to be secure so that this business can still operate. It's not security for the sake of security. It's security so that that lab test can get to that doctor. It's security so that that money can get transferred from bank A to bank B. It's not so that the crypto works perfectly, darn it. Right? It's that security for that purpose. And so being able to sit down and say, okay, let's look at the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and then here are some different mechanisms that can get you there, and and here are some different ways that you can test for those outcomes that you're looking for, and give organizations the opportunity to continue to work in ways that they can still get their business done and still achieve those security outcomes. I think comes from dialogue. And sometimes we don't think about those business ramifications when we're looking at security first for the outcome. But it's the combination of those that becomes critically important. And that's where those important conversations come from about, if I had the data this way, it would have a much faster impact for me. And so I think it really is those dialogues so that people aren't talking past one another.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add to that too. I think for people, I think everyone thinks when the government sends out a call and says we want to hear from you, it's like let's go get 50 lawyers, let's sit down. And I tell people here at the Aspen Institute, when the White House was working on their cyber workforce and education strategy, we helped people submit comments who have never submitted comments to any government process. It was a lot of nonprofits that are doing the work in cybersecurity, and we did a webinar and we told them like the federal government puts a maximum on how many pages you can send. There's no minimum. And if you don't want to comment on everything, comment on the things that you do have expertise on, but also that gives everyone in government almost like a call. So they now know who to call when they have very specific questions. It doesn't matter how nichey the issues are. And so if you're in the audience, but also if you're online, I would say when the government says we want to hear from you, don't talk yourself out of why you should be responsive. And if that's a dialogue, if that's a request for comments, if that's coming to an event to hear from people, you really, when they say they want to hear from you, they really do.
Can I just say something about that? Because I know when I first got involved with the ITSEC, I just would be amazed looking at these large companies having conversations with the government. And I thought, wow, it's actually making a difference. I think for many small businesses, we don't think it's going to make a difference because we think we're one voice and we don't have the, hundreds and thousands of employees behind us. But my experience has been really different. So I just encourage small businesses. They actually do listen, and actually it does inform, the decisions they make. Yeah.
I would agree. I would remind everyone that advocate is Latin for add voice. That's really what you're doing when you're advocating. You're adding your voice to the policymaking process. That's my PSA. Um, Morgan, Eric, we want to hear from you all about what engagement looks like in the private sector.
Honestly, I think all the points that you just made are the relevant ones, right? Take the opportunity. The National Cybersecurity Strategy will be the hot topic at every forum, every conference, every meeting, every collaboration for the, I would say near future, but probably the next year or 2 years, right? And the insights that I know that I get from those collaborations, from those forums, from those discussions really weigh on me in terms of when we talk about implementation, what are the right steps? And so, to the point that was made, speak up, your voice does matter. We are looking for inputs on how to actually implement this in a way that we can all achieve success and the outcome we're seeking to achieve. And so, I would just offer that there are a bunch of different forums. If you bring that input to it, a lot of it is all coming back to the right people who are making those decisions. And so, I would just encourage people to really lean forward in that space.
I think that is very well said, and in the spirit of having voices heard, all the time for Q&A.
Okay, great. I think we're gonna have people pass mics. I think the mics are coming. So we have one question there.
Small room.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Bolton with Google. You talked a lot about public-private partnership, and obviously we work a lot with all kinds of governments, support that extensively. But a lot of what we're seeing on the cybersecurity front, I mean, secure by design and the policies that we support in terms of making our products and services secure, a lot of that is done already at Google. But there's also, like you're talking about, engaging more and doing more, putting more requirements on big players, and we think that that's right. I mean, we have a lot of ability to scale, and so we want to be able to do that. But there's also a ton of pressure, right? There's a lot of pressure domestically, right? Antitrust bills, the focus on big tech, and internationally in terms of data localization and pressures to undermine some of the policies that we put in place for security by localizing data and taking away our ability to be resilient, right? And we're facing those pressures across the world. So can any of you say anything about your thoughts on the sort of the various pressures that the companies are facing?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Tatiana. Good to see you, and really thanks for the work that you and the team are doing. We particularly appreciated your company's great blog on secure by design default. That was really well received and appreciated. So I think it's really well taken that we at times have countervailing pressures where there are investments that are pro security, that are pro resilience, and then there's certainly at times, particularly outside of the U.S., are policy prerogatives that can undermine security. I think this is why, to pull out a thread from the last dialogue, why having the private sector's voice in the process is so important, right? Because certainly, speaking for myself and Morgan, we are from security agencies, right? We wake up every day and eat, drink, and sleep security. There are other agencies, both in the U.S. and certainly with our foreign partners, who are seeking other policy objectives. And frankly, it is the role of government to both internally within the U.S. government and then with our partners to reconcile those priorities and have those forthright conversations about where how do we rank stack priorities, and how do we ensure that if we have shared goals for security and resilience, those are not undermined by other goals that may be sought. And so I think, as a broad point, really looking forward to the further engagement with Google and partners on these topics and making sure that the security agencies can keep being a compelling voice in the room to reiterate the importance of strong security by design and default, and the importance of enabling partners like your company to really continue to be leaders in this space.
Great. I think we have. Oh, sorry. We have
real,
someone with.
real quick. One other opportunity here, and it gets back to the point on standards. And there is an opportunity here for international standards to help play a role to alleviate some of the pressure. It does not solve all of this very difficult and challenging issue that has more than just technology at play. I'm very aware of that. However, I think as the cybersecurity community, both nationally and internationally, try to get our partners and our other national governments to play in standards bodies and our other companies across the board to play in standards, that can help alleviate some of the pressures that organizations feel around some of these kinds of issues where you can point to a global standard and then everybody is and has a fair playing field. So that is not a full recipe to solve some of those problems, but it is one that I would go back to and try as a piece of the puzzle.
Hi, Ed McNicholas from Ropes and Gray. I love all the discussion about public-private partnerships. I think it's a long-term solution. But when I think about cybersecurity in DC, I think about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, as being very significant players. And they tend to, particularly with the new SEC cybersecurity rules, almost anything you say about cybersecurity can and will be held against you. How do you reconcile this call for public-private partnership at the same time you've got agencies that are independent but are really taking out the stick and beating on companies right after data breaches?
Thanks.
I heard your mic.
Darn. It's a great question. So I'll offer a few thoughts. The first is, certainly speaking for CISA, and I think for the other agencies that operate in this voluntary trust-based model, our use case for collaboration and partnership is demonstrably different from that of the regulators, right? And I think Congress, realizing that fact, has given CISA very strong authorities to protect information shared with us from disclosure in regulatory action, FOIA, civil litigation, et cetera. And so I think, while regulators, receive information, demand information to inform potential enforcement actions against victims or other entities, our goal is very different, right? And our goal is both to help victims, but more broadly, to ensure that we are doing everything we can to share information to help the broader ecosystem. And so I do think that, it is fair to think of our national cybersecurity environment as operating in two different levels. There is the voluntary trust-based model, as manifested by CISA, by Morgan's team at NSA, the SRMAs, and then conversely, the regulators who demand information for their particular authorities and their purposes. I do think that, it is certainly our hope that as we mature and advance this voluntary model, as we begin to shift the focus to say, let's focus a little bit less on the victim in the first instance and ask some better and deeper questions about why breaches keep happening and what can we do on an ecosystem level to drive broader change. We do hope that those independent agencies that you referenced, will work with us to broaden our conceptualization of the cybersecurity problem, and that perhaps we will see follow-on change as a result.
To your point, right, when we talk about public-private partnership, we often say that there are all these different types of relationships. There's cooperative, there's compliance, there's contractual, there's regulation, and all of those roles have very specific functions and purposes, and they should all have a seat at the table, maybe just not in the same room. And so that's part of our model. To Eric's point, right? When we talk about voluntary, mutually beneficial relationships, which means you have to put in some to get some back. When you put regulation and compliance in that same room, that sharing tends to decrease. And so we want to see the benefits of all of those different types of relationships in this very delicate ecosystem. It's one of the reasons that all of those different types of relationships are mentioned in the national strategy.
I'll just add to that too. The private sector has really good advocates in the people that are leading these public-private sector partnerships. And so what you don't get to see from the outside is when Eric and Morgan are advocating for the private sector in front of their government counterparts across multiple agencies. And that's not something that anybody can brag about, but I do want to tell people that does happen. And so a lot of the times there are things that are happening behind the scenes that your partners are doing on behalf of you in the rooms that you can't be in.
Ken Lieberthal, the Brookings Institution. This is a fabulous discussion. I want to ask Dong a question because you seem so excited about playing with the future of quantum computing and sustainable cryptography in that world. You highlighted, I think very sensibly, the complexities and therefore the amount of time it will take to really develop good defense in a world of quantum computing. Quantum computing, my understanding is a massively disruptive technology. When that becomes really operational, the world changes in terms of ability to protect anything that is currently protected by encryption. How do you see handling the difference in time between the capacity to attack and the capacity to defend in a quantum world? Generally, my sense of the evolution of offense and defense in the digital world over the last 40 years has been offense is almost always ahead of defense, and defense is always trying to catch up. But when you have this kind of massive change, where are we?
So there's a big challenge today where you can collect information, so harvest it now, hold on to it until those quantum computers are out there, and then be able to decrypt information. And I think there's been a lot of work that has started on looking at hybrid approaches where you use a combination of the cryptography that's out there today, and then some of these schemes, cryptographic algorithms that we see coming into play, and working both of those together. And there are some standards bodies that have taken some of those approaches. The big challenge with some of this also is the life cycle process to develop the algorithms, to prepare the standards, to get them in play, to do the conformity assessment, and then to get those certified products out and into products, and then get those products into into use, right? So that used to be done in a very serial fashion. one and then one and then one and then one and then one. And so you had like a 15-year period before you could see some of these changes occur. I think some of our my colleagues and friends from NIST and NSA started looking at this problem and saying, okay, how do we do this in more of a parallel fashion, where we start looking at both the algorithms that need to be updated, but also where some of this needs to be done so that we can work on the problem more in parallel. And a lot of good work's been done there. I think some of the places we haven't seen as much work that I would like to see are a couple of places. One of them is in the standards bodies and being able to look at some of the protocols and how to use some of the protocols and get them more in play faster with some of the changes that we're seeing with the new algorithms. The second place is looking at some of the physics from the quantum side and thinking about what are those physics changes going to do, and how can we use that from the crypto side in the defense world, and are we getting everything out of that that we can? So that's why I'm keep talking about that resiliency that we can take a look at across the board. But we have, I think we are changing the time scale a little bit. Is it fast enough? Probably not, but it's much faster than we've seen with crypto in the past.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I see 3 hands. I think you've had your hand up the longest, though. All right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. To build on the kind of questions around quantum computing and post-quantum encryption, I had this revelation recently. I was looking at a pamphlet from a company that I won't name that was talking about quantum computing enabled encryption in such a way as if they would encrypt your things with a quantum computer, and then it would be secure against quantum computers, which is not how quantum computing and the quantum computing threat works. And coming myself from a cryptography background, and being, I like to think, pretty young still, have seen blockchain go from something really interesting with a lot of possibilities into an absolute swamp full of hucksters selling nonsense that is like totally disconnected from the technology. So given that post-quantum computing is going to be something that is like really necessary everywhere, how is the government thinking about creating a good ecosystem that is not full of snake oil salesmen doing this? And just to add a little bit of a twist to this, given the NSA historically has a legacy of subverting the development of strong encryption standards like like DES and RSA, is there self-reflection about kind of saying that yes, the United States government can be trusted, that this is an open process, and no, the NSA is not putting its fingers on the scales to support intelligence collection? Thanks.
Yes.
So
There was no-
quantum grifters.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, right, one of the things that we are definitely leaning forward in conjunction with our NIST counterparts is when this type of technology comes out or the narratives come out, how do we dispel and say, hey, you really need to think about the modernization efforts and don't think that there's a shortcut that you can leverage from a technology perspective. And here's why, right? Here's the fundamental things that you need to look for. So we are thinking about that on how we create a trusted ecosystem that people can think about working with and who are the right type of people to talk to. From an NSA perspective, fundamentally, one of the huge shifts that we made, to Donna's point, in the last couple years is we stood up an open and transparent Center for Cybersecurity Standards. It actually exists at the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. It is in conjunction with NIST, Commerce, State, a few other entities, where we are openly talking about a lot of the work and priorities that we have in the cybersecurity standards development organization efforts. We are doing that in conjunction with the private sector because there's not enough work happening in this area. It is a huge effort that we had to make, and we are primarily focused on how do we make that future technology, cloud, crypto standards, internet protocols, secure in a way that it benefits all of the US civilian population. And so that is a significant effort. NSA openly talking about a lot of their standards efforts, especially on the defensive community side.
So no, even having someone from NSA here with us, this is not necessarily the norm. I would say probably 2 years ago, I don't even know if this would have even been possible to have someone from NSA here with us publicly talking about public-private partnerships and asking people to engage. So I also think that is an example of not only are they saying, they're also doing the work, and they're trying to be more inclusive than previously.
So I think my experience coming from NIST in the past and working on some of these standard development activities, you can see historically from the very initial call for algorithms all the way through the selection process exactly what happened in that process. And therefore, you can see how everything occurred. And because of that, from the international community, these algorithms, people have been fairly comfortable with them. I have seen, and this is me speaking personally now, not for NIST, with the quantum algorithms that they selected, the 4 algorithms that have been selected. I have seen that there are companies around the world who are implementing those and making them available in products and services. So that's super good. The snake oil question and how you get to that is where you have that certification or that validation kind of process. And how do we do that? How do we create a validation process? So NIST has a process for validating these algorithms, but how do you do it at a speed that keeps up with industry and the products and services in a way that doesn't compromise the security kinds of capabilities that's looked at in that validation process for crypto products and services through FIPS 140, and they are working on how to have a more agile process. And I think that's really, really important, particularly here, so you can get these algorithms in products and services and get them out and in use quick in a faster way than what we've seen in the past. But I think if you really want to dig into everything that's happened from the beginning, from the selection process all the way to the algorithms that were selected and why they were selected, you can go through that history and with the community. And it is a community effort. It is one of those public-private partnerships from a worldwide perspective that I think is really, really phenomenal.
Yeah, I'm about to make a cyber joke. Just laugh, even if it's not funny. I feel like if NIST can figure out the standards for which we call peanut butter, I feel comfortable that working with a private. Oh, y'all missed the whole. Like, no one laughed. It's fine. Cyber jokes are hard, y'all. But I do feel like that is a good example of it's the standards coming together. It's the public-private partnerships coming together, and I think that's a good place for us to close. I want to thank everybody for coming today and joining us online. I also want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us today. As Morgan has said and everyone has said, we'll be talking about the cyber strategy more, especially everyone in this room. This is the Super Bowl, and so we'll be talking about it for months and months to come. And thank y'all for joining us.